My name is John Reed, the CEO of CATA Alliance, and that basically is a lobby group for innovation. We try to move the standings from middle of the pack to first place. You know, Canada's not doing all that well, so we're going to count on your intellectual capital to boost the ratings. Interesting panel. It's on really public policy and data regulation, and we just launched an open data campaign. But before I get to that, I get lost easily, and so I arrive at events early, and so I was at Tim Hortons, and I got a very important email from my wife. John, all night else forgiven. Can you turn on the heat? Well, of course, I have a Nest app that's on my app, but she doesn't have that app. So I turned on the heat, and I did a good thing at home while I was eating my Tim Hortons donut. I then this weekend had my granddaughter over. She's 7. I taught her about Spotify. She forgot her device, so I lent her my device, and I went to work out. So I pushed Spotify, and I got the most unusual songs. I mean, like, I was introduced to a whole different world, and I'm wondering, my word, if someone got hold of your device and had a totally different lifestyle and pattern, and you hear what's happening with data, like, you know, who am I? So there's a risk there. You know, what do I own? What are the exposures? My his granddaughter's 7 now. You know, I can't correct my music likes now. I'm into. I can't even remember the names of the groups. Nor can you understand the words, really. You know, like James Taylor was my generation. They sang words. That takes me to. You know, we're a Canadian lobby group. But very much we embrace all the latest technologies. We really try to apply the best, and we basically removed borders. So I guess I wasn't surprised when a call came in from Enterprise Car Rentals in St. Louis. That's interesting. I think I paid my bills. So I called up, and it's the head of government relations for Enterprise Car Rentals, the Enterprise Foundation in St. Louis. Fantastically successful company. They want to have coffee. Well, I'm coming to Ottawa. We'd really like to see you. So I said, well, come on over. We'll make you coffee. And they want us to take on the Canadian lead for open data. It turns out that the car manufacturers think they own the data. They want it as their own. And the car rental people are not happy about this. Well, if they're not happy, I'm really not happy. Because I didn't realize that I was providing all this data that other people were fighting to sell. I didn't realize that when I drive my car that there are issues. And hence I said, well, I'm really glad I'm doing this panel, because I'm going to go to them and get some legal and expert advice on how to actually create open data and understand what the risks are. I like to start every session with at least a context statement, because it sort of forces you to, think about what we're going to do in the next hour or so. So the context is business must protect the personal data and privacy of all citizens for all forms of transactions, and non-compliance can be very costly. Lawyers always do that. At the same time, data has to be open to afford opportunities for companies to create new and better products and services based on data analysis and analytics, including the full deployment of artificial intelligence. So people are nodding, and they agree, and I agree. Yeah, I'm going to, panel, you're going to have to take the other side. I want you to argue against that. I think we should exploit this. I think a few people should own it, and they should do very well, not give it to anybody else. So that leads me to the panel with that background. And we're going to set up with a little keynote to again set sort of overview. Very happy to have David Fewer here, the legal counsel, lawyer, from the Canadian Internet Policy and Public Interest Clinic. Then we're going to call up our expert panelists. I've given them lots of time to think about their first question, and then we're going to quickly flip to the audience, and we're going to let you ask as many questions as you possibly can within the time allocated. Thanks for the opportunity of chairing this session.
Thank you, John. All right, so my name is David Fewer. I'm the director of CIPIC, which is the Sandwich and Glushko Canadian Internet Policy and Public Interest Clinic, based at the Center for Law, Technology, and Society at the University of Ottawa. We go by CIPIC, it's easier. The way John introduced me, under his breath, a tinge of disgust laying there. I'm a lawyer. It's true. That's our job. We're lawyers. We're public interest technology law advocates. It's a strange position. There are only two of us in Canada. Our job is to intervene on behalf of the public interest in debates arising at the intersection of law and policy. And what that means in practice is we do a lot of privacy, a lot of copyright, a lot of surveillance law and civil liberties. We also are getting into more and more into some of the more esoteric areas that we were talking about this morning, doing work on human rights and artificial intelligence. And we do a lot of work on data, open data, rights and data, privacy, rights and data, and conflicts between data interests and other interests. It's a really interesting gig. We're based within the University of Ottawa, which means we're a student clinic. Half my job is to be a lawyer, the other half is to be a professor and teach students in the work that we do. If you're a law student, it is a fabulous gig. You get to work on, briefs that go before the Supreme Court. You get to work on interventions before the CRTC on net neutrality hearings, all sorts of really unusual things for lawyers, or for law students, I should say, to get involved with. So it's a pretty good gig. Today, I'm going to give you kind of the short form of a presentation that I've been working on for a while now on the problem with privacy, the problem with privacy regulation. I'm going to talk about four things. I'm going to talk about optimism and pessimism. I'm going to talk about technological determinism, market failures, and let's dip a toe in the pool of solutions. There's a lot to talk about in the solution space, so don't think that what I give you here is the full story. Think of it more as an introduction and an invitation to think about alternatives. So, optimism and pessimism, let me tell you, I am an optimist. Every glass of wine is half full. Every thunderstorm brings a rainbow and maybe two. That's me. I'm kind of like Vladimir to the Estragon in Beckett's Waiting for Godot. I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic for the imminent arrival of the ever-anticipated Godot, whether it's a Supreme Court driving to the rescue on some privacy issue or the CRTC once again stepping in and preserving net neutrality. I would like to think that I'm an optimist. Tomorrow, everything will be better. That's me when I walk into the office every morning. Except it's not true. And I found this out in a really dramatic way just about a month ago. So I participated in a roundtable put together by the Mozilla Foundation and the Law Commission of Ontario on digital rights and digital society. And it was basically, it was a collection of civil society in Canada getting together and kvetching about the state of civil liberties and digital rights in this country. It was an eye-opening experience. I found out that I am fundamentally a pessimist. That's right. Glass is not half full, it's not half empty, it is spilt. It is gone. I have no wine. It was a shock. So I should warn you, this is not just in the privacy space. When I talked about copyright, when I talked about what was going on at the CRTC, when I talked about all different areas where civil society is active on digital rights in Canada, I felt like we're fighting a rearguard action. And that's something to be concerned about. It's not that everything is terrible in this country, but we're on the back heel. That's definitely the case. And let's talk a little bit about technological determinism and why this leads me to where I am in this world of pessimism. So I've seen what started as a very promising and sound, principles-based privacy regulatory framework in Canada devolve into what's effectively a lowest common denominator approach to privacy protection, which is really challenging, really challenging. So our privacy law, PIPEDA, it's a federal private sector commercial privacy law. It's based upon the OECD guidelines for the protection of privacy and transport of data flows. This document is principles-based. When you read it, it looks good. It reads well. It was an excellent document when it was created. It was excellent when it was updated a few years back, not too long ago. But unfortunately, in the manner in which it's been applied and the manner in which it's been ignored, in effect, it too has fought a losing rearguard action and been somewhat, let's say, reduced from its potential to its present. Now, I would say that the market has gone exactly where the technology has permitted it. And something called surveillance capitalism has come to be. So surveillance capitalism is this term coined not too long ago to describe the economy that's built upon monetizing our personal data, often without our knowledge, certainly in a way that not too many of us are familiar with. Essentially, we've been trained to consider our personal data like pocket change, and we give it away without recognizing it as the core currency, effectively, of identity. So we've arrived at a position where it's possible that our democratic institutions themselves are being subverted through the use of personal information in ways that we're not aware of and wouldn't agree with. This is just a quick reference to Cambridge Analytica and Facebook and the election of Trump. But this is not the only story in this space where our personal information is being used for political purposes in ways that we're just not aware of. So how did we get here? I would argue that our regulatory framework is governed by an approach to consent over the use of our personal information, that's dictated by the very shortcomings that our regulatory framework was designed to avoid. So it was designed to avoid market failures. We have a principle-driven law in place. It doesn't rely upon contract. It requires agreement or consent that goes beyond what you'd ordinarily obtain through contract. But unfortunately, it doesn't really, how the law has been interpreted and how it's been applied and how the market has responded to it shows that it hasn't been effective in avoiding some of the failures associated with contract. So again, this is just a kind of a summary of some of this stuff. The literature on kind of the irrational consumer or the irrational economic actor is starting to become more fully developed. Richard Thaler is the award-winning economist who kind of started this work. He's got a great book that he's written with Cass Sunstein called Nudge, which talks about some of these irrational approaches, kind of the irrational economic actor. And the one that I would point to, I think, is most often exploited in the privacy space is the need for immediate gratification, or the bias around immediate gratification. And you know what I'm talking about here. You're on Facebook, and someone prompts you with a survey or a questionnaire. Which muffin is this Hollywood actor most closely associated with? And so you go into that. But you don't look at the terms. You don't look at the terms and conditions. You don't understand what the trade-off is. And even if you did, the attraction of that app right now, or that game right now, or Facebook right now, or whatever the service is right now, grossly outweighs in our mind the long-term economic cost to us, if we're even aware of it, and often we're not. Which leads to the next issue. Let's call it privacy policies, the myth of the privacy policy, the myth of terms of use. Who reads terms of use? Raise your hand. Wow, this is a surprisingly robust 5%, I would say. I would say that's multiples above the global average. The idea here behind terms of use or privacy policies is that's the trade-off, that's the consent, that's the agreement that we're entering into. The reality is that doesn't reflect how we consider entering into these transactions, entering into these arrangements. It's a much more immediate kind of thing. I think that PIPEDA, or the privacy regulatory framework that was prompted by the OECD, dealt with this by saying that no, you can't rely upon contracting norms. You have to get active consent. You have to get consent that's commensurate with the information being collected. And in practice, how that's been determined or how that's been applied has been, click, I agree. Or by the use of our service, you agree, without even having to click, I agree. So very soft forms of consent, effectively amounting to no consent, and certainly no active knowledge, no knowing consideration of the deal. and I'll come back to this. In addition, when you think about what's in a privacy policy, for those of you who have read it, one of the other problems is the meaningless nature of the consent that's in there, right? Of what's being told. Like, do these terms sound familiar to you? We are collecting, this information to better provide you services. Like, what does that mean? We're sharing it with our partners to serve you better. These are actual terms that I got up when I was looking for this. What do those services mean? Does it include targeted advertising? Because that's a different thing, right? Does it include political advertising? Does it include entitlement decisions? Decisions being made by third parties about what you as a consumer are going to be offered? Does it feed into price discrimination? Does your clicking I agree for this free little game now mean that your life insurance is going to cost more because that information is going to tap into a stream of data that you've been providing that says things about your lifestyle? And this is a slightly far-fetched example, but you don't have to do a lot of searching online to see the research that's been shown about price discrimination being used by service providers on the basis of things like browsing history, on the basis of things like what cookies have, third-party cookies have to say about your lifestyle. We're always being judged. We're always being put into a caste of consumer, a category of consumer, and decisions are being made about us on the basis of those categories. And then finally, there's the network effect. And this is the fundamental problem, the fundamental market failure, I think, that really goes to the heart of why the market is unable to discipline abuses or misuses, or simply excessive uses of personal information that people find problematic. This is the idea that networks become more valuable the more people join them. How many of you are Facebook users? Not because Facebook is the best social network out there, but because that's where your friends are, that's where your family is. More people than actually read the privacy policy, so that's good. That's the content. So the argument is that all of these failures kind of pile up and create, let's call it a tilted marketplace. It's not the open, competitive marketplace that Adam Smith envisioned. It's a different kind of marketplace entirely. Now, these aren't the only failures that concern me. I think there have been regulatory failures in this place, and my own organization is somewhat complicit in this. So we filed a complaint in 2008, 2009 against Facebook when Facebook first kind of launched itself from being a small, relatively local, academic-focused social network into something that wanted to take over the world, or at least take over be the primary social network of the world. And the Privacy Commissioner did an excellent job dealing with our complaint. It was dealt with well. The vast majority of what we complained about in Facebook's practices at the time were found to be well-founded, and the Privacy Commissioner put out a series of recommendations associated, responding to our complaint, and Facebook adopted those recommendations by and large. The problem was, during the course of the investigation and following it, Facebook changed its business model, or it launched the modern form of its business model. And it became much more active in doing things like bringing in third parties through its API, bringing in content outside, or bringing in your browsing activities outside of Facebook through things like the like button. In other words, Facebook became all-seeing, or much more seeing than it ever had been before. And these raised let's call it a wide number of privacy concerns within our organization and elsewhere. It was clear to us that something like Cambridge Analytica was going to happen. Not that Trump would get elected. I didn't predict that. But I did predict that we would see widespread misuse of data gleaned through Facebook through the lack of supervision and the kind of loose connection between Facebook's privacy controls and what third parties were able to access through Facebook. And that has come to pass. We've seen firmer regulation in the United States on Facebook through some of these things. In fact, some of the loose third-party controls were addressed relatively early on through the FTC, the federal trade regulator, coming down on Facebook for these loose controls. But obviously it hasn't been enough. And we still have kind of that fundamental problem that I alluded to earlier, which is what I'll call the failure of the chocolate bar test. I'll come to that in a second. The argument at the time about why the Privacy Commissioner wasn't coming down harder on Facebook was that it was a free service. This made no sense to me at all, absolutely no sense to me at all. Facebook has a market value right now at something like $500 billion. And so obviously something is not free about this. But nonetheless, that was the argument that we had. They're giving you something for free. They have to get something in return. And therefore, we're going to have somewhat looser privacy controls than you being me, CIPIC, wanted. But that's where we are. And then we've got the problem, again, from a regulatory perspective, of the fiction of consent. This idea that we're actually consenting to the third-party activities or to the activities of whatever surveillance corporation that we're dealing with. It's just not true. But how did we get there? We got there through essentially regulatory approval of kind of the notice system of consent. As long as you're being transparent about what you're doing, as long as someone can investigate what you're doing, then your privacy practices will generally be okay. And it's only in the most extreme sensitive spaces that kind of a more enhanced version of consent will become available. We always thought, and it was kind of widely considered, that locational information, for example, was going to be that personal information, because you can glean incredible biographical information from location information. If somebody just follows my phone around from my home to my work to Produce Depot and then back to home again, that's me. That's me. There's nobody else doing that. So we would have thought that kind of information would have been treated as incredibly sensitive. No, everybody wants that now. Every app, every single app that you download pretty much is looking for locational data amongst all the other data that they want. The why really comes down to targeted advertising. But nonetheless, that targeted advertising leads to tremendously sensitive biographical information about you. Locational data leads very closely to identity data. So I talked about the chocolate bar test, and this is the fundamental failing, I think. When you buy a chocolate bar, you know the deal, right? It costs you, what, $1, $2 now? There's nothing opaque about that, right? The price is advertised. You go to the counter. You got to give them the money, in some way. You know how much it is. You don't have to look at your bank account later on and find out what it is. It's not like 3 months later you get the statement and you go, ooh, $20. Maybe I wouldn't have bought that. That's not how it works. It's not even that good for privacy. Okay? Privacy is not even, the services that we're consenting to, you never actually know the cost. And the cost might change over time. It might go up over time as your information is used in new and unanticipated ways. If those ways are consistent, like let's say you get consent for advertising purposes, the newspaper advertises to me, or used to advertise to me when I bought the paper edition, that's fine. But that's a different thing from behavioral targeting, right? Advertisements that are targeted to me and me alone because I've been perceived as being this consumer with these interests, who is of interest to these advertisers. Different things entirely. Privacy fails the chocolate bar test, and that's not good. Solutions. I'm going to give you the rough and ready version of these solutions. First of all, I'm a lawyer, so I want to hit everything I see with the law, which is not quite true. But in this space, it's a heavy regulated space, and so law is the first place that we look. And even our current privacy commissioners understands that what's happening with consent and with privacy is off the rails, at least slightly. So what I'm showing here on the screen is a recent consultation document put out by the Office of the Privacy Commissioner looking at the current model of consent to the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information and what's wrong with it. How can we fix it? How can we change it? Other organizations have gone further. So this is the European Union's GDPR. How many people have heard of this thing? Yeah, everybody's been whacked with new consents, right, to new privacy policies to deal with the GDPR. So this is, I would call it the leading regulatory framework in the world at this point dealing with this kind of stuff. And some of the solutions that I would propose are solutions mandated by the GDPR. So there are, and it has moved away from kind of the OECD-led vision of consent to something that's quite a bit more active. Particularly, it's endorsing things like layered consent, which is that idea that You can't bury the deal in the terms of use. You've got to do something different, right? You've got to provide that information up front in a more nuanced and detailed, and yet still easy to understand way. It's a difficult challenge, but that's the deal, right? Other forms. Let's talk a little bit about DuckDuckGo, which is competition. The idea that other organizations or other mechanisms are available to help regulate privacy. DuckDuckGo is just a different search engine, a different model for driving a business than that adopted by the market leader, which is Google, of course. DuckDuckGo says we're not going to build our business model based upon your personal information. They still do advertising, but it's advertising based on a different model. Other suggestions. This is, again, my pessimism creeping in. I'm a little bit pessimistic about the marketplace being the solution, competition being the solution to this for some of the market failure reasons I spoke to earlier. This is the current market capitalization of Equifax, which is a data broker, an incredible business whose service is us. I mean, data brokers sell information about us. We're not the customers, we're the product. So Equifax had a tremendous data breach about 18 months ago, a little bit less than that, more like 12 months ago. And that's that big drop in price. I've been interested in watching the market capitalization of this company as it creeps back up over time. My prediction is in less than another 12 months, it'll be back to where it was before the drop. 12 months after that, it'll be a historical anomaly. Hope I'm wrong. Hope things change. But I don't think the market is going to discipline these guys. Back to law, still looking at law. This is a class action. Outside of data regulation by a regulator, by the privacy commissioner, there's the law, there are the courts. And we're starting to see the evolution of, let's call it, extra regulatory legal solutions to privacy problems. I think expressing some frustration in the inability of our custom regulators to deal with these kinds of things, and allowing class actions to step in to make claims that will help discipline companies. These will do more, I think, than our existing regulatory solutions have done to discipline companies. But outside the law, again, there are other solutions. This is technology. So Privacy Badger is a browser plugin that's developed by a privacy advocacy outfit from the United States, CFF, and some of their partners. These are technological tools to help us protect our privacy. This is one example. There are many, many others. And there's a movement, again, very embraced by the GDPR, to basically embed privacy by design into technological solutions. In my view, this is probably going to be more effective at protecting privacy than all of the consents we can build into user experiences, or at least as many as we can imagine. But they can't do them by themselves. I think the solution on privacy by design and these kind of technological solutions is to require them by law. So it's an indirect legal regulation of privacy. It says, regardless of what the privacy laws offer, collection, use, misuse of personal information, you have got to be secure. You have got to be safe. You have got to approach your technology, your services, considering privacy first. And build that into your service, build that into your technology. And if you fail to do that, then you will violate the law. The intention here is, of course, to discipline companies, carrot them, stick them into a particular approach to protecting privacy by using technology. And then we often talk about norms, the idea that that norms are regulated, that we behave a certain way, not because the law requires us to, but because we should. We should behave this way. It's fundamental. I don't think norms have been effective in the privacy space for a bunch of reasons, and I'll give you a few here, just a few. Number one is the phenomenon of the startup economy. The idea that capital is dissociated from norms. Consider, this is probably a good way to think about it. Consider a startup company who's got 18 months to live. They've got 18 months of capital to go through, and you're getting to crunch time. The incentive to go short on privacy and go long on market, let's say market penetration, is consistent. And if market penetration includes less than ideal privacy practices, then privacy tends to be a fatality of that economy. And this is true even with more mature investors. So, the startup economy looks at VCs and they're interested in getting a return on capital. But this is even true for things like pension funds, and pension funds, mutual funds, more traditional investment vehicles. Think about, I often think about my mother, who is an ethical person and certainly has never shied from telling me how I should behave in any given situation, including my professional legal ones. That having been said, her investment vehicles don't do that. I mean, she invests in mutual funds, and their motive is getting return on capital. That's what they do. That's what they've been set up to do. Even ethical investment funds, if you take a look at the kinds of things that they invest in, privacy hasn't been a space that ethical investment funds have traditionally looked at as within their ambit. In fact, they tend to think that these are highly ethical investments because they don't pollute, they don't sell guns to African warlords. They do things that we like. They innovate. They create jobs. And so I've been frustrated somewhat with the idea that norms are going to save the day. And that's just a teaser. I'd welcome your comments and questions when we get into the question period. Thanks for your attention.
I'll have the panelists join me on stage. You already have your first question. After you get your comments, we have a commentary from each. And I've actually got an order here. You don't have, we'll find you. So we're going to start with, everybody's all hooked up, mic'd up. I think we need, everybody's, one more mic needed. We're going to start. So I'll have each panelist introduce themselves before they make their comments. We'll start with Daniil.
Yes.
I know, you're behind me. Hiding. Well, do you want to do a little switch for your presentation so we can see you?
Yeah, sure. I can actually stand up and just...
You're going to stand up?
Yeah.
Oh, sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Daniil Zborivsky. I'm a director of software engineering at a company called Python. And my team at Python is building software to help companies perform large-scale analytics on data, right? So like this topic is really, really kind of important to me. But I look at it from a technologist lenses, right? So I write software, we build software, and that's kind of the look that I take at this problem. And I guess what I'd like to add to the keynote, which was really, really great and really informative, is that the problem is really significant. And I think that just the governance and legal regulation is not enough. What I will try to, the point I will try to make is that I don't think technology has caught up to the regulations that we're trying to impose on the data privacy. Because what's really happening, and at Python, when we work with different customers and they come to us with their problems around data analytics and we solve them, I kind of was making some observations about how those companies behave and what kind of problems they have. And the challenge I see is that it's pretty clear what's happening with the companies like Facebook and Apple and Google. It's their business model to collect data. And we're seeing issues now happening in that space. But I think it's just the tip of the iceberg. And the iceberg is way bigger than just Apple and Facebook, because there's thousands and thousands of other companies whose direct business is not data, but who collect, retain, and analyze ridiculous amounts of information about customers. And the problem in that space is that since the business of those companies is not data, is that they often have no idea what they have. They have no idea what data they collect about consumers. They have no idea where it's stored, who has access to this data, and how this data getting processed. And that's a result of the way the industry works right now, because we as technologists made it very easy to collect this information and store it for cheap. So companies use that, but they don't have any framework, neither legal or technological, to make sense and to organize the data in the right way and to make sure that the governance mechanism can be actually implemented. And really, I think without the technological support to be able to tell what data is available about the consumers, how it moves across the systems. And again, the state of the things is that like the reason people and the organization, the reason it's really hard for them to kind of get a clear picture of what they own in terms of information is because the current software architectures, if you look at them, they are distributed, right? There are a lot of microservices. They all perform like very specific function, multiple teams working on them. So there is no single way for them to agree, yes, we collect this information about the user on the website, and we pass it along these several systems, and that's where I end up being. And then somebody decides to ship this to a third party for further processing without actually telling anyone. So like that's the kind of problem that we are seeing. And the point I'm trying to make is that technologically, we have been solving the big data problem, right? Everyone knows about big data. We collect a lot of information. We can process it in distributed fashion. But I think this is beyond big data, because now to be able to reason about data movement, you actually need to trace how every bit of big data moves across the system, how it's being shared with other parties, and have a log of this information, which you should be able to provide to the consumers of the data or to data owners. Like this is big data factorial, right? You take this huge information set, and you now need to have a data lineage or data traceability for each item. And that, without that, I don't think we can impose any, like we can impose regulations, but I don't think they will be implementable in that sense. Because this data right now it's impossible to trace. It's really hard to trace. Additionally, like it's not only about the machine-generated data. It's not about log files and click streams. It's also, we interact with the physical world all the time, and in a lot of cases, this interaction ends up in some digital records. So talking about GDPR, a few weeks ago, I was speaking at the Data Summit in Boston, and I was attending another session about GDPR. And what kind of got stuck with me is that apparently there's a provision in GDPR that has a special treatment of data information about children. And you may say, well, I don't market to children, I don't sell to children, I don't employ any children, why should I worry about that? And then imagine you as an employer suddenly change your benefits provider or insurance provider, and somebody in employees fills out the form and they list children that they have. And suddenly you have this data and you don't even know about it. So like this bits of small data that we kind of produce while interacting with the world, they also hard to track. You wouldn't even know as the organization leader that you would have this information until something comes up and you will need to do something about it. And as far as I'm aware, nobody's really working on the technological aspect of these things. There is no open standard. There is no open technology to be able to set this governance framework in place. There is no way for us to say, so what is this format? When I go to the organization and tell them, give me all information you have about me, there's no standard about how this information is going to be provided to me. Like, will I get a CSV file? Will I get an XML? Will I get just a binary backup of a database they have? Nobody tells you what you will have. And again, like GDPR does tell you that people should be able to request information about themselves. So I think before we can address this problem as a whole, there's a whole new set of technologies that needs to emerge to support that. So first of all, I think there needs to be a set of open formats to not only exchange data between organizations, but also exchange data from the organization that stores and processes it to the person who is the data owner. So I would like to request information about myself from some org. There needs to be a pretty predictable format about how that's going to be given to me. And then finally, we do need some technology that will allow us to trace the data movement, because like we're now hearing that, yes, Facebook shared data with the cell phone manufacturers, and nobody really thought about how it was done. But I would like to know exactly how data gets from point A to point B. So I'd like to have this trace. How exactly is it going to be implemented technologically? It's a really, really interesting and I think really, really challenging problem. Maybe the blockchain is the answer, but it's not ready from scale perspective yet to support that amount, like this amounts of data. And because we can't involve kind of, if for each case where we need to tell how data got from A to B, if we need to involve like a government investigation or something like that's not a framework that will be scalable. And finally, I think another set of technologies that will need to emerge to support that is the tools that will help humans to reason about the data that they get. Because as I said, machine-generated data, so clickstream data from the websites, it's really messy data. So again, if I go to organization and tell, okay, what information do you have on me? If they send me a bunch of log files from a web server with my sessions, how I interact with the website, that's not useful. Like, it doesn't tell me anything. It doesn't tell me what kind of analysis they can do on that. So I think in that, like, there's a whole set of tools that will need to emerge that will allow people to reason about this data. Maybe it can be assisted by some form of artificial intelligence where they would be able to get this data and say, okay, this is information that we have on you, and this is how it can be used. There are some glimpses of that these days where we, for example, can detect sensitive information automatically, like credit card numbers or first names, last names, email addresses, PI data, things like that. So I think those tools will grow, and it only empower those tools. So once we have all those three capabilities in place, I think we can actually start seeing that these frameworks, governance frameworks, will start making sense.
Sure. Absolutely. So I think I'm going to use these mics just because I need my notes here. So first of all, thank you very much. My name is Maria Mialkovic. I am from IBM, and I am grateful for the opportunity to come and bring IBM's perspective here today in this very engaging discussion. I think we're just going to... I do have some slides, so maybe we'll just wait for those to... Okay, great. So, clicker here. So this was, can you see that okay? Did they show up okay? This was the resolution that John presented today. And again, this notion of, businesses are tasked with this very large challenge of protecting personal data and privacy of our citizens and of our clients. But at the same time, we all understand that in this space of artificial intelligence and machine and deep learning in particular, the insight and the successful deployments of AI are when we have larger data sets and are able to leverage as much data as possible to build and train those models. So how do we go about solving this problem? Okay, so then fundamentally, I think if we step back, so based on the resolution that was presented for the talk today, and if we think about all of the challenges and limitations that we discussed this morning, fundamentally we are talking about building trust, right? So trust is the key for an organization to be successful today. So recognizing this, IBM has prepared and published our principles for trust and transparency, okay? And again, we feel that, it is our responsibility to our clients and to society to establish and to commit to fundamental principles relative to data and responsibility, okay? And so we kind of have to establish this as a way of doing business, but it's not enough to establish only principles. So we have to demonstrate to our clients and to society that we will deliver them. And how will we deliver them? Well, we are, of course, of the opinion, as some of my previous panelists shared, that technology will solve and is able to solve many of these problems for us. Okay? So again, all organizations will want to leverage AI to disrupt, to change, to make progress. But again, we as organizations are being judged by how we use data and how good stewards of data we are, and ultimately the organizations that society will trust will be the ones that succeed. So if we take a look at then our IBM's principles for trust and transparency, they are fundamentally three things, and it was interesting to hear the discussion this morning and how they align. So the first one, of course, the purpose of AI is to augment human intelligence. Again, the message here that man will work with machine and not be replaced by the machine. Key points here again that we perhaps should not be worried about the jobs that AI will displace, but because fundamentally I think the reality is that AI will create more jobs than will be replaced. And so what we should be focused on then perhaps is what training and investment in skills do we need to do to prepare new generations and even existing generations for those new jobs that AI will create, okay? So the question this morning based on the example, so what are those new jobs then potentially? So I think, there's a focus on roles where human emotion and empathy are required more than ever before. So there is discussion that AI has the potential to disrupt radiology. So one might then consider roles where a healthcare worker who has immense capability and human abilities to translate a result from a radiology report, deliver those findings to a patient would be in much high demand, and that is potentially where we have a need for more workers, okay? Similarly, it's a opportune moment to discuss, so much has changed, within society because of technology, but we haven't really looked at how we have evolved our education processes. And so Dave Mackay, he's the CEO of RBC, is a outspoken supporter of looking at how we can change the way we deliver education and prepare students for this new world. In IBM in particular, there's a program in the US where we take a 6-year high school program to prepare students to enter the workforce, a system known as PTIC again. And you hear of our CEO, Ginny Robity, she'll make reference to new collar workers as opposed to other color workers. So next point, data and insights belonging to their creator. Again, we are very open and committed that we do not leverage our clients' data for our own benefit. So our policies around data and insight ownership are very clear. Again, very interesting relative to the comments again around the fine print today. Data privacy again and data security, and we have for decades and will continue to make huge investments around security, and and quantum is a whole other subject and topic, and hopefully you're aware of some of the work we're doing there. But again, fundamentally, we believe that technology can solve so many of these problems, and are they solved? No, they are not, but it is our responsibility and our task to solve them. So AI systems must be transparent and explainable. Again, the third tenet of our principles for trust and transparency. So being clear, when AI was applied, the sources of the data, the methods used to train. We talked about bias again this morning, a known problem, but again, a problem that technology can solve. And IBM research in particular has done some work in this space. It was a particular use case for image recognition and pictures of people. Support for transparency and data governance policies, again, ensuring that we adhere to them, and then an explainability of AI models, of neural nets. Again, this is a huge requirement in every vertical, whether you're in finance or in healthcare. You need to be able to understand why the model came to that decision. And there's a lot of folks in IBM research doing very interesting things around contrastive explanations, where they've taken the approach that they look for missing information to kind of explain why a model made a decision that it is. For example, a dog has no wings, and so it's a dog kind of thing. So teaching meaningful explanations. Again, it was a recently published paper where again, an approach for neural net explainability where you actually include some of the domain expertise in the training data to help you better explain the model. Okay, so you know, again, the approach was, and the message I wanted to deliver today, so we establish a set of principles and then we deliver and technology, we build and deliver technology to support those principles. So I have here an example, particularly in relation to the resolution that John presented around you know, training different data sets, disparate data sets that may not all be in a similar location, or you may not all be able to bring them together. And so this is again work that has come out of IBM research with a technology known as Fusion AI. Basically, you could have a data set sitting on one continent, on one set of systems, another data set sitting on another continent, potentially in the cloud. And then this is technology that allows you to you know, train machine learning, deep learning models on those disparate data sets, but then collecting the weights at a fusion manager that brings all of that information and then sends it back to the local models to continue updating and training. Okay. And again, an example illustrating where you again, you know, you don't necessarily need to move the data to be able to accomplish the task, to build a more accurate model. You know, the point of if the data has to stay where it is, you build and implement the technology to keep it there. Okay? And, you know, a simple bar graph, again, explaining that your accuracy in your models will improve if you aggregate the results from both of those training sets versus if you had a model that you trained separately on the data from one continent and the data on the other one. So, but I imagine there are many data scientists in the room that could attest and relate to that point. So in addition to that, the concern around security, again, and to this solution, we add what is known as trusted artificial intelligence, and Danil brought up the point of blockchain. So what happens now if we take this federated AI approach, federated machine and deep learning approach, and we embed blockchain in that solution. So now, you know, in essence, you've built a technology that allows you to demonstrate the provenance of your models. You know, these models some of them are often open source, downloaded from very different places, and you know, you have the ability to, you know, when you're training in your separate locations, to lock that information on the blockchain, send it to the Fusion manager, aggregate the weights, lock that onto the blockchain, send it back to the separate environments, and in essence, leverage blockchain as a tool to ensure your data or your models have not been tampered with. Fundamentally, what does a solution like this give you? It allows you to integrate the AI insights from data found in different systems. Your systems can be in different places, on different systems, in different countries. There is no need to move the data. You're moving the AI insights instead. Blockchain AI and trusted AI, again, fundamentally allows you to ensure provenance of models, provenance of data, and bringing that all together. So again, you know, it was just an example based on the resolution that John had presented, that really we can leverage technology to solve many of these problems.
Okay, I think I'll stay seated. My name's Peter Pulsfer. I'm with the National Snow and Ice Data Center at the University of Colorado, and I also chair a number of international data sharing groups. So I'm going to speak about something that's a little bit different than we've been talking about, which has mostly been focused on personal data, and my area is looking at scientific data primarily, and the data collected for understanding our physical and social environment, primarily in the Arctic. So as chair of a number of these international groups, really what we're trying to do as a community is to try and bring together data from across projects, programs, but right on up to the national scale. So bringing together data that's been collected by different governments and research laboratories, et cetera. It's a fairly complex space because we're dealing with a number of different scales. So we have science that goes right down to the molecular scale, right up to the cosmic scale, and everywhere in between. We have a temporal scale where we're looking at things that are millions of years old, right through to future forecasting and things like the IPCC and so on. We also have many different disciplines, so we're defined by the region, not by a discipline. So it's not like we're saying, let's get the biologists together and figure this out. We have hundreds of different subdisciplines and dozens of disciplines, ranging from social scientists and ethnographers, for example, right through to people doing cryospheric science on ice and so on. So it's really complex in that regard, and we also have complexity in that we have studies that range from an individual grad student who is doing 1 month of data collection to hundreds of scientists working together over a decade for hundreds of millions of dollars. And all of those sort of fall into this category of bringing it together within our community. So we have many challenges. It is, I think, comparable to some of the discussion we've had around, the ethics as well, because it's not private data, it's publicly funded data. For the vast majority is publicly funded. So we're talking about billions of dollars of public money invested over many, many decades. So we have to be thinking about more than just, the proprietary kind of approach. And so we have technical issues, and we have groups of people around the world who are looking at those technical issues. Some of them came up in Maria's conversation or her talk about distributed systems, and we're looking at various types of distributed and federated search, as well as mediated data sharing and so on. Interoperability, how do we get all these systems around the world to be talking to each other and sharing data in a meaningful way, et cetera. And there are good reasons for that, of course. One of the reasons is for better science. The more data that we can bring together and the more we can bring it together in a meaningful way, the better we can understand the planet, the social systems, and so on. The other is very practical. It's cost. The data that are collected in this area are, in some cases, multiple orders of magnitude more expensive than collecting it down south. Just as a very simple guideline, my trips to Baffin Island, which it's part of Canada, it's about a 2,000 kilometer trip. I can do 4 trips to Japan for 1 trip to Baffin Island. So if you start thinking about data collection in that regard and the types of technologies that have to be developed and engineered to be used in those extreme environments, we've got a really big cost component to managing the data and making sure that it actually survives and is well used and reused. So those are all sort of from a technocratic approach, but what we're finding in the recent years, particularly since 2008 when we had what is called the International Polar Year that really brought together many different nations around these topics, is the big challenges are in the sort of social, organizational, and the governance aspects of this. So some of the challenges include our regulatory mechanism. So the dominant regulatory mechanism is this idea of open data and the idea that particularly publicly funded scientific data should be open. And I think many of us, all of us agree with that. But what we find is as we get into the details, there are caveats to that or things we need to think about. We're also working very closely with Indigenous peoples of the North. Not all of those data are the same as a weather station or data coming out of a weather station. There are sometimes very important ethical and privacy considerations for those kinds of data. Similarly for social science data, because we're dealing with the social sciences as well. So what we've adopted in an international statement that we developed a few years ago is this idea of ethically open data. So you must consider the ethical aspects of open data when you're pushing towards that goal. The other thing that really is a big challenge for us right now, and we've held a number of meetings and workshops in the past couple of years to try and come to some conclusion, is we have a soft governance approach. There is no single entity that manages data or manages science for the polar regions, and particularly for the Arctic. We have groups like the Arctic Council, which are the 8 circum-Arctic countries that come together and they sort of work together under sort of a quasi-legal environment. But what we're finding now is there's a huge push from non-Arctic nations to play a role in the Arctic. So countries like China, Germany, Japan, Korea, et cetera, are very much involved in investing in science in the Arctic, as well as looking forward to things like shipping and so on. And that's actually happening now. So no longer can we say, okay, it's just those countries that have sovereign territory around the Arctic that are part of this solution. And we're starting to see different geopolitical entities come up even in the last 2 years around this. We also have new things coming. We probably within 10 to 20 years will start to have a central Arctic Ocean fishery. That's not existed in the history of humankind. So we're now having to think about, wow, what do we do? What's the science around that? What can we do in terms of managing it and so on? So countries are starting to get together, and data is at the core, at the central part of that discussion, and how we bring data together, and how we manage it, how we regulate it, and so on. And in that case, there's a regulatory framework that doesn't yet exist that we need to establish. And that's really the first time in human history where we've been able to establish the regulation before the resource extraction starts. So those types of things are really critically important. Economics are important. We're expecting up to $1 trillion of investment in the Arctic in the next 2 decades. So this is becoming big business. So it's no longer just about the scientists and the science. It's how is that information being used. What we're starting to see now is a crossover as well into some of the topics we've talked about here. It used to be that the science was done at research laboratory, primarily at universities. My center was started in 1976, so it's been around a long time. But we now have Google coming to Arctic science meetings and proposing that Google Earth Engine be the platform for Arctic science. And I think there are a lot of great opportunities there, but we're not having the discussions about what does that mean to have the public scientific data moved over to a private cloud and a private virtual research environment. Right now, it's again a very technocratic approach of, oh, look what we could do with the data there, but not what does that mean if in 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years Google changes the policies around those data. So I think that's something we need to be having a discussion, and it shouldn't just be the scientists or the data managers. As a society, we need to have that discussion because in this case, the Arctic is a really important part of the whole global environmental system. We're seeing some good developments now. We have a number of organizations. So the Arctic Data Committee is looking at this. We have groups like the Global Earth Observing Group, GEO, a number of indigenous organizations, et cetera. And I think what's really positive is we have a meeting of ministers happening called the Second Arctic Science Ministerial, which will happen in Berlin in October. And each country can assign a number of researchers to a science advisory committee. And for the first time I've seen it, they're starting to or to recommend data scientists to this. So 5 or 10 years ago, that strictly would have been cryospheric scientists or social scientists. So we now have a situation where close to 30 ministers from around the world will be getting together and talking about this, and data will be on the agenda. But I do think that we need to be thinking about all of these topics that we've talked about here, but with a different kind of data. So, thank you.
I will stretch my legs. I have
Sorry.
the slides up if you get a chance. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for sticking around all day. My name's Craig Burkett. That is me in the picture, believe it or not. It's 3 months ago. I'm a data scientist at Luxar IT, and I'll just take 30 seconds to briefly explain the company in case you haven't heard of us. We're headquartered here in Ottawa, but we also have offices in Toronto, Halifax, and Montreal. Been around since 1999, and we're basically a software services company. Our main focus is on enhancing the mobile experience, doing data science, which is the best part, and the cloud computing environment. And then Internet of Things, which is sort of a synthesis of those 3 things together, is another area that we focus on. At Luxar, we always say you're not just getting a bum in a seat, you're hiring a team. So we've come up with 3 pillars of the data process. One is data engineering. That's munging, cleaning, sorting, grabbing all sorts of data. The data science part and then visualization and presentation of what you found. And we also take into account an advisory or a strategic role at the beginning. So we like to be involved with people who like to be involved in an end-to-end solution right from the beginning. What that essentially means is that if someone comes to us and says, hey, we got a bunch of data, can you tell us something about it? Those are the projects that we like to have. Okay, end spiel. Here are a couple of our clients. And then a brief description of my journey to get to Elixir. I started my career as an aerospace engineer. I thought that was a really cool job to have coming out of school. Unfortunately for me, right when I started my career, the Columbia Space Shuttle exploded. So for the next year, I was actually just moving paper from one side of my desk to the other, and I got really bored of that. So I took a sick day in March, went around and applied to a bunch of private schools to see if I could be a high school teacher. I was able to get a job teaching high school for 5 years, and I got the stats course dumped on me because nobody else wanted to do it. And that's when I fell in love with stats. But I was more or less making things up while I was doing that, so I decided to go back to graduate school, study it properly. And from there, I got a position teaching at the University of Toronto, which I did full-time for 4 years. Started my own consulting business too. And then my wife said, hey, I don't want to live in Toronto anymore. Let's move to Ottawa, where my family is. And I said, sure, why not? I grew a beard and started working at Elixir, where I've been for a year and a half. There we go. Okay, real talk. So the title for this panel, when I read it, was Authoritative Data, Rethinking Data Regulation. And I took a gamble that most of my co-panelists would focus on the Rethinking Data Regulation part of that title. So I decided to be different and focus on the authoritative data part. So here's the generally accepted, more or less consensus model for the data science process. Maybe you've seen it before. It's right off the Wikipedia page for data science, so top stock there. Where in this process do you think that people, let's just explain it quickly. We've got the world, we collect raw data, process the data, sort it, aggregate it, merge it, clean it, maybe do some exploratory analysis, come up with some fancy algorithms, maybe make some predictions, maybe try to make some research questions and answer them. And then we communicate our results through a dashboard or a report that nobody reads. And then maybe we spit some data back into the world for somebody else to use. So where's the focus in university in this flow chart here? Well, we could vote and everything, but I'll just tell you, having taught it for 4 years, we almost entirely focus on models and algorithms. That's what we teach. I don't know why, maybe because it's the hardest and it's the coolest and the sexiest part of it. But if you've practiced as a data scientist, you probably know that that part of the job is usually 1 to 5 lines of code in a high-level language. It's not where the majority of your work is. So where is most of your time spent? Well, it's usually spent in processing and cleaning data, which isn't nearly as much fun, and they don't tell you that in university, but has to be done well. But I'm going to ask the question, what is the stage that's most critical for the accuracy of your final product? And by that I mean, at what point in this flowchart would a failure most divorce your results from an actual relationship to reality? And I'm going to go ahead and say that's in the collection of raw data. And my argument for that is, suppose you use the wrong model. Suppose you're trying to make a classifier, and instead of using a neural net, you use naive Bayes. You're going to be off by 2 or 3% from your final answer. It's not going to make a big difference. Suppose you make a mistake in the cleaning or the processing. Well, assuming you at least do it somewhat well, if you miss a few outliers or you miss one variable, you might be off 5 to 10%. But suppose you get your data from the wrong place, or you get it from a biased or a crap source, then you have garbage coming out of your models. You have garbage coming out of your predictions. It doesn't have any bearing on reality. And I feel like we don't focus on that area at all, so I'm going to talk about it for 5 minutes. So how can it go wrong? What are some things that can happen here that go off the rails? Well, one, in the context of scientific data, you can have an inconsistent protocol. Maybe I'm collecting data from my site, and Peter's collecting data from his site, and we're not doing it the same way for some reason. Maybe we speak different languages, or we just don't feel like we don't want to work together, and we have our own ideas. But then we try to merge these things together. At the end, it's inconsistent. Or maybe you're collecting data passively from a website. You've got 2 versions of a website in different countries or in different languages, and the fields and the keys are different here. And you try to merge them later, and they just don't fit, but you cram them in anyway. So there's a source of error. Transcription errors. Maybe you've got humans trying to write data onto a sheet. I worked on a project less than a month ago where part of the data flow process was somebody writing numbers from a PDF onto an Excel sheet. So you can have those human errors. Even optical character recognition is not perfect. Missing data is a big problem. It could be structural missing data from merging data sets where things don't line up properly. It could be actual missing data where you just didn't collect things. Biased sources is another one. So this could be a case of, say, a news website which has an obvious political leaning and is presenting you with data. And that data is obviously coming from a biased source, but when it gets consumed, it's consumed as raw data, and you don't sense the bias there. We have bad sampling techniques, which can range from convenience samples, where you just grab what's convenient around you. You can have more subtle ones. There's a good story. Has anyone ever heard of Abraham Wald? Hoping no. Okay, 2 people, good. So he's a really interesting guy. He worked on what was essentially the Manhattan Project, but for math nerds during the Second World War. And a bunch of Army officers came to him and said, a lot of our fighter planes are being shot down, and we have a bunch of these planes, and we can see where the holes are. How much armor can we put over the holes? And he kind of thought about it for a bit, and he said, don't put the armor where the holes are. Which makes sense, right? Because if the planes are coming back with holes in them, you don't need any armor there. It's the planes that aren't coming back, and you can't see where the holes are on those ones, that's where you should put the armor, which obviously makes sense when you think about it. So that's actually a specific example of the survivorship bias. Our Army officers were looking at a data set that was just the literal surviving planes. They only saw those planes, and so the conclusions that they drew from looking at that data set were totally wrong. They needed to look at the things that they couldn't see. That's a very insidious type of bias that creeps in. We also have nefarious individuals, so these could be outright evil people, or they could be well-meaning people, and I've worked with a few of them. These could be people doing their PhD or assistant professors who are pre-tenure, and they've been working on something for 3 or 4 years, and it's just not really shaking out the way that they want it. This research just isn't good. It's not good, but they've been working on it for so long, and damn it, they're not going to go back and start another 3 years of that process. So they just fish a little bit for some p-values, and they get something, and then they publish it. I would call that nefarious insofar as it's wrong and it's unscientific, but it's not so evil. So in case you think that's not really a problem, the field of psychology, which is one of the most quantitatively rigorous fields of science that are out there, recently audited a few of their studies. They tried to replicate 100 experiments that were done in the field of psychology. You probably know the scientific method usually uses a 5% error rate. So how many of those 100 should they be able to replicate? Should be 95, right? Anyone know how many they actually replicated? 36%. So that's our scientific method. These are rigorous quantitative studies. This isn't crap research. This is the best research that we have in the field. And we have a reproduction rate of 36%, which means 64% false knowledge. And that's not fair to the public. And then at the bottom, I put fake news, and it's kind of hard to avoid this. I just checked on Monday for some fake news stories and found a laundry list of them via Snopes. So we got into data for a while. Can you really avoid fake news? I'm not sure it's that easy anymore. So back to the nefarious individuals, we have some governments, and I'm not, for example, suggesting that these are the only ones. I'm sure that North American governments do this too. If not the government, at least departments of the government are guilty of manipulating statistics to make points. But we have some clear examples of entire countries doing that with their economic data for various reasons. And if we can't even trust governments for authoritative data sources, well, then who can we trust? So these decisions are important. Right? The Paris Accord is our agreement to try to save the planet from potential human-caused damage. And our metric for determining whether countries are keeping up their end of the Paris Accord is the statistics that these countries produce. If we can't trust them, we can't really decide who's meeting their Paris Accord targets at all. And nuclear non-proliferation is another serious one, and also democratic elections. So out of this, I've seen a new business that I didn't think that we even needed. This is the Canadian and the American version of nonpartisan groups that basically check what politicians say. So any claim a politician makes, you can go on these sites and then gets a score from mostly true or true to pants on fire lying. And I encourage you to do that. It's fun to see. You can vote for the people that tell the truth the most if you want. Okay, is there one question that's maybe the most important for finding an authoritative data source? I think that's probably, for our day right now, climate change. And the question I had for myself was, is there even consensus on this? Because I've worked with some people who deny climate change, and I won't make a judgment about that. But I looked up a recent Gallup poll, and what I found was that 64% of North Americans believe that there's climate change, and that's human-caused. So say what you want about that. It's definitely not a public consensus, though. 64% is not universal agreement. In the scientific community, we have 97% who agree about human-caused climate change, but what they don't agree about is how to measure it and what to do about it, what types of graphs to present to make a convincing point. So there's a whole debate about, do we take the measurements on land? Do we take them on water? Should we look at high-frequency past data, low-frequency past data? How far to go back? And I think that the failure here is that there's no authoritative data source to say, here's the data for climate change, let's look at this and make the discussion this way. There's just so many data sources, and if you want to, cherry pick one of your data sources, you can make any claim you want about what's happening to the global climate. So that's a bit of a problem. I made a spectrum. I think we have a choice. We can go to the left end of the spectrum where we have totally centralized control of data by authorities. There's some pluses and minuses to that. The obvious minuses are clear. The pluses are that we know where to go to answer our questions. The other way is to go totally decentralized and let citizen scientists produce the data. Now that's inherently good for many reasons, but it's also inherently bad because you get a lot of noise if you do that. So myself, I'm a somewhat recent parent. I have a 1.5-year-old daughter, and during that 1.5 years, I was faced with some points where I needed to make a decision about what kind of parenting to do. So being a good engineer, I went and did some research to see what was the scientific community saying about to do this. And my findings there, I would say, if you find yourself in that position, just don't bother. There's no consensus on anything at all. The only advice you ever end up looking at is the people who tell you just do whatever the hell you want to do. Not only does that feel good, it seems to be the consensus anyway. So you get lots of anecdotes, you get lots of observational studies, you don't get any experiments because it's not very ethical to experiment on small children. And I wanted an answer. I want an answer for these things. I want to know how to do this. I want to know not just what I feel, but what's the best way to do it, and I can't. So here's a situation where I would welcome an authoritative data source if one did exist, and I would use it instead of the noise that's out there. Just to close, I clicked random article on Wikipedia. I found this one about something in the Roman Empire, and I sure didn't read it. One thing I noticed about this, and I was looking for it, so it was clear to notice, was that pretty much every sentence on Wikipedia is cited by something. And that's where we move to in text. It's the new way of doing technical writing. If you're going to make a claim on the internet, well, then you better provide a source, or people aren't going to accept it. So I wonder, will this soon be the new way of speaking too? Well, if as soon as we have a way to do it, can people demand citations for every claim you make? Hope not, because then I'd be out of a speaking engagement. Thanks very much.
Presentations. We'll move to the Q&A, but I get the first question, so think about your questions. Come to the mic when you're ready. So my question, which I gave you lots of lead time, I want you to make the case for the car manufacturers that want to keep the data from the cars. I want you to help me with that. I guess I should, Dave, I guess I should start with you first. We haven't heard from you for a while. So help me with that. How do I keep the data to myself? I don't want to share it with the car rental companies or anybody else. It's mine.
Yeah, there's been some really interesting proposals out there, kind of pro-consumer proposals about how to retain better control of your personal data. Mine, that I put out there, wasn't widely picked up, was the next time you go to the grocery store and they ask you for your postal code, ask for a toonie and see if they'll make the trade. They won't. But some of the other proposals out there that I've seen that are a little bit more interesting are basically asserting intellectual property rights in your information and having a terms of use that attach to that. Having a privacy policy that attaches to that. There's actually this phenomena in law called the war of forms, and that's what contract governs: the purchase order, or the bill associated with that, or the responding payment invoice. So the war of forms. So there's a theory out there, anyways, that consumers do have more control, more power than they use, but we just don't have tools available to us to assert that. And so one proposal is to create the consumer's terms of use. It's more than a proposal. Cory Doctorow, who's associated with Boing Boing, which was that blog that ran the article about CIPIC that was on, I think, my second slide, and also part of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. He's backed this kind of format. And there actually, if you search it, you'll find a consumer terms of use. Hasn't been widely taken up, but it's one potential source to dealing with that. At the end of the day, though, I think if you really wanted to push that kind of approach, you'd need a regulatory response. You'd need kind of a government pushing, basically, asserting a state-level allocation of entitlements that grant greater entitlements to the consumer in this space.
Good insight. And I digress a little bit because I got a good idea from Peter. International Statement for Ethically Open Data. Now, that helps with the openness, and we're building a global coalition. So, that was good advice. But let's forget about that. You're helping me. I'm a car manufacturer. I don't want any international statements for open data. It's mine. How do I make the case to keep it closed?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult one for me in that we tend to push for open data, but with respect to the ethically open data, that's where we looked at what are reasonable exceptions to that. So I think what we'd have to do is have that car manufacturer say these are reasonable exceptions for these reasons. The ones that we focused on were ethics, i.e. do no harm with the data. And so we pull back data that could actually do more harm than good. And I think in a corporate environment, they may be able to state that within a capitalist society that doing damage to our stockholders, our shareholders, would be problematic, and they would need to demonstrate that. I know the head of NOAA at the moment, or one of the, I think the vice heads of NOAA in the United States is coming over from Panasonic, and he is questioning open data. He's saying, is this actually a disservice to our organization? Should we be charging for it? Should we be pulling it back? And of course, in the science community, there's a huge pushback to that. But I think we need to have that discussion. He needs to be able to be clear that it's actually not doing harm to the organization by making it open. So that's generally what I would say.
And it is privately funded. It's not publicly funded.
Exactly. So
you know.
I think they are within their rights. They might have to explain, though, if it's data about their users, is that private?
So I own some shares of Ford Motor Company. Should I declare that? Maybe I'm biased.
Exactly.
Yeah,
right? So these are the conversations I
think
think we need to have and have open conversations about it.
Yeah. Now, Daniil, you're not hiding back there. Chair, so
I'm here.
But give me a little bit of advice on this. You know, I'm a car manufacturer. It's mine.
Yeah, so it's interesting because our customers always, the first thing I hear from them is like, we want to compete with data. We want to perform better than our competitors using the data that we have. And the question is how? So I think the case here is, if you look at the companies in the same space, they probably either have or can easily obtain access to pretty much similar data sets. But it's not about the data. As we heard in the previous presentation, it's about what you do with data. How do you clean it up? How do you enrich it? And how do you feed it into your BI or machine learning models? So that is the intellectual property. The data itself can be quite useless if it's not being processed properly, if it's not being cleaned up. So I think the case here is that, yes, some data sets, let's say you generated them or you acquired them, they are your property. But I would argue that the actual IP is in the process of cleaning up and making sure that it's available for your analytics. Like, that's where the value is.
I have some confidence in the car manufacturers that they will probably figure out how to monetize that. They'll be able to hire a lot of smart people to figure that out. But I should move now to Maria. Any thoughts on that one? Give me some advice here.
So, you know, based on Daniil's comments, I would argue that there is significant value in the actual data. So you know, if you don't have good data or you don't have a lot of data, you can spend, you know, a ton of time preparing it and getting it ready. But the value and the insights are found in the actual data, and that is what you know, helps companies differentiate themselves against one another.
So if I'm looking for an exclusion list, it's going to go back to that point.
Absolutely.
All right. So let me just with Craig.
Okay, so to make the point that you're trying to make, that the manufacturers own this data, I would probably go back and draw an analogy to 150 years ago when we were opening up the West. A company might say, listen, I'll mine that mountain for you, and I'll build the railroads, I'll build the town around it, but I get to keep what's inside. And that was a deal that countries more or less took, and it opened up the West a bit. So as a car, I don't believe this, but as a car manufacturer, I would say, because I'm actually creating this data, you wouldn't have it if it weren't for me. I'm mining it, I get to keep it, and you can have all the other tangential products that come out of it. That's the case I would make.
Good story. I'm going to hear that one again. Yeah, exactly. We'll move now to the floor for some questions, please.
Hi, this one's actually for Daniil and probably David.
Okay.
So I thought that your interpretation of the right to access portion of the GDPR was really interesting because it says that consumers need to know if their data is being used, where it's being used, and for what for. They don't necessarily ask you to provide raw data because that doesn't mean anything to anybody. So what are your thoughts on, obviously that's a problem. So is it really that hard to give consumers those answers, for one? And number two, do you think paid models versus freemiums might solve some of these issues?
Great question. Yeah, I think, like at least what I'm seeing in the industry right now, it's extremely hard to get this information out because the current systems that are in place are just not designed for that. They are not designed to extract bits of information, trace it across maybe, like a typical IT system is right now, 12 to 20 different systems. And each of those are split into multiple services and stuff like that. So it's really hard to extract the information from those systems. So I would say that the requests, if we will start seeing requests from the customers under the GDPR to provide this information, some companies will struggle, who have not been kind of invested into that space before. And in terms of the freemium versus kind of free, I'm not sure like how exactly you interpret that, but I think there were some interesting discussions earlier today about if I'm the owner of the data, so if I'm the person about whom you collected the information and you're monetizing that, am I actually entitled to a portion of that revenue? Right. So like one of the earliest panels were on this discussion. And I mean, I don't have a very well explored opinion about that. I think it would be great if I get some money for my data, but I also being realistic, understanding that we just don't have any technology to support that right now. Like it's impossible if somebody asks to do that.
Right,
really
and I hear you on that, but what if you could opt out? What if you could say, well, I'm going to give you this information and I'll enjoy your services for free, or I can pay you X amount of dollars and keep my data to myself.
Yeah, I think that's very realistic, and a lot of the systems out there, like especially advertising systems, they behave exactly the same way. You can pay money and get rid of the ads, or you can watch ads all day and use the service for free. So I think that is somewhere where our industry has actually kind of been doing it for some time already.
I'm going to fit in two more questions, but any other comments on yes?
I'll just do it really quickly. So we tested on access. We've got an access provision built into our current law, and we tested on that over a decade ago now. And the failure rate was astonishing. The number of companies that failed to provide just basic level of access was astronomical. I can't remember the exact numbers now, but it was well over 50%. And so I think the problem in our law now is the lack of teeth. GDPR has more teeth, and so maybe we'll see much more attention paid, much more incentive placed on corporations to pay attention to that side of the data puzzle. The other question, which I think is really interesting, and it's always put out there, why can't I pay for the service? I think there's one fundamental, that slide that showed the market value of Facebook at $500 billion, that's why they don't want you to pay for it. They would not be worth $500 billion if they priced themselves at $5 a decade ago. And so there's just this view that the opportunity cost of pricing a service built on surveillance is too great. The potential for unforeseen fortunes, unforetold fortunes is there on data. And so that's, I think, why we just haven't seen a more traditional market establish itself in those services. I'd love to see it. I mean, I would pay for Facebook just to get my mother off my back.
Okay, two more questions on my left.
Okay. Hi there. So a few years ago, credit card companies decided that they were losing too much money on credit card fraud, and so they put together a set of standards in terms of how credit card data could be controlled and used, and said to their customers, their merchants, look, if you want to continue using our credit card information to run your business, you need to follow this standard. And so they have a standard that's not legislated. It's basically self-imposed because they have leverage. So I'm just wondering to the panel, and maybe Mr. Fuhrer, but is there any instance of that you guys know of out there that personal interest groups are banding together so that we can use our own leverage and our own personal data to kind of self-impose the industry to a certain set of standards, so that we can use the power of numbers to say, you want to use our personal data, because that data is only good because it's volume. So if we can use that power of numbers to self-impose some standards, and maybe that's kind of what GDPR is going to get at, but I'm just curious.
Okay. Any volunteers? Yes.
I just want to make a quick comment, right? You, at the end of the day, as the consumer, vote with what you do. right? So I think it's our responsibility to, choose what companies we engage with, who we do business with, and ultimately, at the end of the day, that's how we will change situations like that.
Last question.
Okay, so I'll make 2 comments and 1 question.
Well, as long as it's not a long comment.
Yeah, it's the comment. The first thing is on car data. It's been around forever.
Okay.
What's happening with the autonomous cars and the new versions of cars which have built-in Wi-Fi in the car is they're actually communicating from car to car and car to ground and car to sky. They've been doing stuff car to sky for a long time. Everybody who signed up for OnStar was already having all their privacy removed because they knew exactly where you had that car. And it just depended on who they sold the data to. So now it's going to become easier because they know where your autonomous car took you. So that would be my first comment. My second comment is blockchain. I think you want to think about blockchain and GDPR because if you have the right to be removed, how do you get that out of a blockchain and still have an intact blockchain? I'd like to hear that. And then the other thing is, of course, data between blockchains, because your friends are using Ethereum, my friends are using Hyperledger, and somebody else's friends are using Dragon Chain. So there's a thing called ISO TC 307, which is about 6 years away. So I'm not thinking that you're going to exchange blockchain stuff very easily. It's a nice nascent technology, but it will be changed 3 times before it becomes where it needs to go. Anyway, so the actual question was, what about data and long-term collection of data? Because I know that even in industry, when we pull data sets for people to repopulate them into a new application for them, because they may be coming from several mergers and acquisitions and pulling data sets, so probably worse in a climate change place where you might have sensors that are bad as well. But the data formats change over the years. So how do you account for the change in data formats and the possibility of bad sensors, because I like to pick on our environment guys. Just how would you account for all that over the long term? So if we're doing 20-year studies of data, how do we go?
I see nods.
Sure. Yeah, that's an issue that we deal with constantly. It is a bit of the elephant in the room, both the question of long-term preservation, because there's very little what we call A-based funding. A lot of this stuff is done discretionary funding by Congress in our case, or Parliament and so on. It's quite regular, though, to bring on resources to do what we call reanalyses. So if you have a sensor issue, you can look back and say, okay, we have new calibration data. That will be reapplied, but it's expensive. So it's something that what we're trying to promote now is this idea of the data life cycle that goes right from data collection through to long-term preservation and things like reanalyses, because we know it happens, and it's happened sometimes simply because they've improved, understandings of the sensors that were used and so on. But it's not what we call, it's not really popular with research or in research funds. And this is what we're trying to get through to higher levels of government. It's not all about just the innovation. It's also about maintaining the data that you have.
Forever in the cloud.
I get to change the rules a little bit. I know we're at time. We'll fit that question in as the last one. Go ahead.
So I'll quickly answer that question with 2 answers. The first one is, how do we deal with it? And I think the way that we do deal with it is whoever collects the data acknowledges that the data has uncertainty, and then they pass it over to an analyst who conveniently ignores the uncertainty and pretends it's perfect. How we should deal with it is we should do what most scientists do, is propagate that uncertainty down to the finished product. And if the finished product is, I think this, plus or minus, I have no idea what I'm talking about, then the feedback has to go back to the data collection. If it's not fixed there, there's no step along the way that's going to fix it.
Great. Very last question.
Okay, it's a continuity of that question here. If we have all these different sources for the data and it has been processed one way or the other, then my question is, how do you manage the pedigree of the data to make sure you don't reuse the same data and then increase the bias? I could see blockchain maybe as a way to have a unique identification, so it will follow the data. But since there will be different standards, it seems to be very difficult. If you have a different format, then how does it match in the new one? I'm afraid it will create some kind of, I will call that data incest, so it will bias the result. That's why I'm afraid sometimes of this type of big data when one group do one analysis, and then they reuse this data with some other data, but finally it was the same data, and they just amplify the bias you had at the first place. So I feel that we need to have a better metadata or pedigree to make sure that we avoid this type of errors and don't bias all the statistic or the analysis we do with it.
I see a lot of nods, so we'll have one last response from the panel. Everybody's nodding, so any volunteers?
I can probably talk to that. Yeah, I'm not. I mean, it's actually a problem that we're dealing on on an everyday basis, right? Because with big data, we made it so easy for a lot of people to kind of build their own pipelines and transformations, and we say, oh yeah, have access to all those resources, and everyone's just build their own stuff. So it's really hard to understand and reason about how data actually moves, not even across different organizations, even within one system. Like two teams can't agree on, hey, should we use this data set or that data set? And the way we think about it is, yeah, exactly, having some layer of metadata sitting on top of these pipelines that would say, okay, this data source have been acquired from this system, this is what happened to it along the way, and this is what kind of transformation have been applied to it, so you can actually trace it back. How do you do it? I mean, it's engineering software problem. We're working on it. There are some products out there that help you do this. But I think, yeah, having this layer of information about information, like that's the only way around it. Otherwise, you will never be able to make any sense after a few months of development on the platform what's actually going on there.
So a round of applause as John Appenson approaches the stage. Lots of work, excellent presentations, great questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, I enjoyed that. Yeah, pleasure. Thanks.
That's great, eh?
Before you all disappear, I have a very important announcement to make. The bar is open upstairs. We have a reception where you had lunch upstairs right now. At that, we will be announcing the winners of the poster competition up there. And before that, I'd like a round of applause from you for the organizers, for the volunteers outside who did a wonderful job, led by Laura Gong. I think she's still outside. And for those students here who are interested or have expecting to join the speed dating process, your friends are outside waiting for you. So thank you very much for the day. Fabulous day. And